Good afternoon. Welcome to the 4:30 edition of GrrCON in this here room. I think we call it the 4:30 edition, or 16:30 if you're one of those military timey nerdy guys like me. So I'm happy to present Amber Welch. She's going to be talking about GDPR and a bunch of other acronyms. So, Amber.
Thank you. That's a very accurate summary, although not potentially very exciting. So I hope you enjoy it more than just hearing about acronyms. I'm Amber Welch. I work for McKinsey. I manage the security and privacy program for the healthcare analytics, data analytics processing. So we provide a few services to healthcare organizations, and as part of that, we have healthcare data, and it's my responsibility to protect it while it's in our care. I've also worked in audit and assessment for privacy law, so primarily CCPA, GDPR, things like that, and have also worked managing security and privacy for a multinational hospitality software organization. So I've seen privacy from a few different directions and across a few different countries. So to give you a little context, I usually give this as a 1-hour talk, but I'm going to be trying to fit this into 25 minutes, so we're going to skip a little bit on a few things. I won't take questions here, but I will leave immediately. And if you want to talk to me there, just go outside. Also, I'm on Twitter, so if you can't catch me, feel free to reach out there. Also, all of these slides will be available online, and there is content in a GitHub repository as well. So if you want to look up any of the legal references or find any of the references for sources that I've used, everything's available there. That direction. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today is what data subject requests are, some of the evil things that you can do with D SARS, and defense strategies if you're in charge of an organization that is responsible for responding to any of these requests. So data subject requests. Anybody familiar with this term? It's been familiar to Americans for a little while now, but still maybe not something in common vernacular. So what we want to be aware of now is that we're in a global privacy era. The advent of GDPR, which isn't European law, changed the context of privacy law because we no longer can think only of our ability to comply with our own region. So we now have to comply potentially with privacy laws for other jurisdictions if we have data on those residents. So it kind of has changed the nature of compliance and changed the way that we think about how we structure programs. So the US, the EU, Brazil, APAC region, Canada all have similar privacy laws with a few different changes. The access laws that we're going to be talking about today is a particular right that people have to access information about themselves. And there are differences between the regions, but usually they kind of follow the same sort of principles. So I'm going to talk in terms of the GDPR just for ease, but do know that you can kind of apply these principles to different regions. If you're working in maybe Canada with PIPEDA, it's very similar. So there are 4 primary rights under this category. You have the general access right, which is the ability to access all of the information that a company holds on you. The other one is modification, or sometimes called the right to rectification. This is where maybe that company has incorrect information and you can request that they fix or update that information. So if they're saying that you're a serial killer, then you get to say, oh, hold up now, let's not go that way. You would also have the right to erasure. This was often called the right to be forgotten when people were talking about GDPR when it first came out. Also called the right to deletion. These are basically all the same thing. This is the one that made companies panic the most, especially the ones that heavily monetized personal information. There's another one called the right to portability. This is a little bit lesser known, but one of the risks here is that if you were able to successfully execute a portability request, which is the right to transfer to a competitor company, you could potentially get personal information that way as well. And it's less commonly known, so maybe organizations haven't done a good job of preparing for that one. So there are a few different challenges that are new under this kind of new world of privacy compliance. We have the challenge of metadata and indirect identifiers. So we in the US tend to think of privacy as very much PII equals human readable personal information, names, addresses, telephone numbers, email addresses. So that's kind of the HIPAA era of understanding privacy. But now GDPR and the upcoming CCPA understand that there may be machine readable information that a person can't necessarily look at and know that it is associated with a human being. But in the context of a larger record, it could be personal data. So we need to switch into an understanding of personal data as hackers understand it, really, which is that you might be able to tell who someone is from information that isn't immediately obvious as personal data. So this is really a good thing for us. We have moved forward in this.
Is that like location data?
Location data is, yep. So precise GPS data. And there are, when you get into the complexities of it, you have to, there are ways of identifying how precise it has to be before it becomes personal information. Also, we have household and device data, and we really have CCPA to thank for bringing this to light. This is information that's associated with IoT vehicles. People who are simply visitors in your house are covered. So this is really good because we know that this is how information works. So we're kind of moving forward on that front. There's also a new concept of linkable data. So this means that personal data, which isn't currently associated with an individual, but could be combined with another data set, is personal data in its current form. So one of the challenges here is that you may have personal data that you don't know for sure can't be linked with something and become identifiable. So the more conservative approach is to assume that the data is going to be personal information. There's another really interesting concept here, which is from the EU, which is the idea of a data controller that doesn't necessarily have actual control over the data. The EU defines data controllers as the organizations who kind of control the means of processing, and data processors as the contractors, the people who just follow directions. So one of the interesting things that happened is that this man, Mario, submitted a data subject request to Google Spain, and he asked them to delete information. Google Spain argued that they were just an indexer and couldn't really do anything about it, even though they did have control of the information. They hadn't necessarily done anything active to gather it aside from their general indexing. The EU disagreed and then did force Google Spain to comply with the request. So we have to understand that even if you simply have come across the information, you do still have responsibility for executing these requests. So essentially, any data that can be linked is personal information and should really be treated as such. So companies generally panicked about this. If you remember about a year and a half ago, people freaked out. They didn't know how to deal with it. The response was generally hire lawyers, provide all of the information when you get a request, and basically don't do anything that could lead to a complaint. So the companies didn't tend to think of incorrectly fulfilling these requests as a data breach, which it is. So there are two primary ways of fulfilling these data subject requests. There's a manual process, which is you send an email or fill out a web form or talk to somebody in person. They take the information down, run off, and fulfill the request. There's also a way of doing it by authenticating into an account and then doing a button click. Some companies have gone the direction of using the authentication for the ID portion and allowing you to start the process, but then fulfilling it manually. So this is kind of the 23andMe approach. So companies usually choose which approach they're going to take based on technical feasibility and the ROI, essentially how difficult it will be or expensive it will be to go either direction. So that's kind of the high-level overview of what these requests are. So what kind of evil things can you do with it? I'm sure you've already got some ideas just from that information. One of my favorite ones is the concept of legal DDoS. So fulfilling requests is actually very difficult. Even the requests that are completed in an automated way have their own risks and are very expensive to set up. So what can happen here is that an organization would be subjected to a potential flood of requests. This is especially problematic for ones that need to be processed manually or have any kind of manual component to them, because an organization could have, say they only process an expected 10 to 15 per month, and then they have 1,000. You do have a limited amount of time to comply with these requests. So if you miss that, you do risk non-compliance. You're also a lot more likely to make mistakes if you're just trying to churn through a gigantic list of requests. This also happens naturally and organically. So if you remember a couple of weeks ago, Blizzard ran into a little bit of hot water. They had an incident related to a Hong Kong protester, and there were a lot of people who were very angry about this. So what they did, what a lot of the gamers did, is flood Blizzard with data subject requests. It was very funny because I started giving this talk before this happened, and it was unfortunate for Blizzard, but interesting to see this actually play out in real life. Blizzard didn't really have a very good response to this, which we'll go over later, but this is kind of something that you want to assume will happen naturally as either a public data breach or when you have bad press. So this may even be something that you would want to put into incident response planning to have capacity to scale for data subject requests if you get a large flood. And to really drive this home, the data subject requests can be extremely expensive to fulfill properly, especially if you have to redact any information or you have sensitive data that you're working with. James here had a data subject request that cost £240,000 for a midwifery clinic to fulfill. So this was because he submitted a data subject request in response to the death of his son, which he believed was wrongful. And the midwifery clinic wanted to protect their own position and not provide that much information, so they outsourced this to a legal firm. This is obviously a very extreme case, but would be very expensive. The average cost for a data subject request that has to be fulfilled manually, the only place I could find stats for this was in the UK, but it cost £145 per request. And guess how much companies are allowed to charge to submit the request? Nothing. Yes. Absolutely zero. So this is completely free, and if you're combining that with this legal DDoS, it could become profoundly expensive and disruptive to your organization. So as an example, Twitter decided that I was male, which I found very entertaining. So I asked the DPO. I went to their forum and said, hello Twitter, why do you think I'm a guy? And a couple of weeks later, I get back this extremely lengthy and probably lawyer-written response. So on a whim, I can essentially cost them legal money. I could continue having this conversation with the DPO. You guys could go and do this yourselves, check it out, see if you have any questions, and you can have a conversation with that legal team. And they have to spend resources to respond to you, and it doesn't cost you anything to ask questions. So, does anyone remember Ship Your Enemies Glitter? So someone was inspired and decided to create Ship Your Enemies GDPR, which is a form that will auto-generate a request that asks for every single legally available data subject request under the GDPR. Every single one. There are even more. There's 7 categories and subsets under them. So if you really want to ruin someone's day, I'm not suggesting that you do this, but this does exist. And the thing to remember is that this is perfectly legal. And it's also very confusing for companies because boilerplate text is often how we identify phishing. But if actual human beings are using it, how do you know the difference? Okay, so some phishing tactics. I'm not going to spend too much time on this for the sake of time, so take a photo if you want to. But you can use data subject requests for phishing because it's really the only time that you get to engage with a company in a perfectly legally valid way, just asking for information. That's literally what this is for. This law was created to allow you to ask for personal information. So you can do things like ask for updates verbally. You're allowed to do that under the law. You can ask to speak to the privacy officer. You can claim that you can't access the email. They can't refuse to fulfill it just because you don't have access to the email. You can also, this is another thing that you could do. If you had a data set from a different organization, you could potentially use some of that information to try to get through the ID procedures for a different company and then extract additional information and build a profile that way. So this is where you would possibly be able to make progress on a spearfishing attack or a CEO fraud. Another thing that's interesting is that companies don't tend to tell the data subject if they do identify an invalid request. They just ignore it. A lot of times they don't even really document it. They just don't respond, or they might say, like, we won't fulfill this. So a person who was being targeted for an attack like this would potentially never be informed of that. You can also escalate with family names, especially under that household request type, and escalate to higher value data. If there's an organization that does have escalated vetting procedures for the identification, you can try to get in with a lower sensitivity request and then ask for additional information, financial or health information beyond that that's more sensitive, because you might already have that verified checkbox on your name. Another thing that you can do is use common names. And I'm always very sad to tell people this because I have a very common name, which is why I think about this. I get a lot of emails from other Amber Welches, and I try to respond as much as possible saying, like, that's not how email works. Please stop doing this. But people who have very common names would be potentially very good targets for this kind of attack. A lot of organizations use government-issued ID as a means of verification, even when they never had that government ID before. So it's not like they're matching up with existing information. They're literally just looking to see that you can submit a copy of a driver's license with someone's name on it. So there are quite a few problems with this. Imagine what a name really tells you, aside from the fact that is your given name. So some reasons that you might want to use this type of phishing attack is that you can confirm profile data. If you want to identify that the same person is associated with two different records, you would be able to match them up that way. You can learn new data. If you're already working on some and you want to build out that data set, you can get additional information. And the spearfishing. So there was a group of researchers in Belgium who actually tested this, and their method for doing the automatic one wasn't quite as strong. But if you look at the statistics for the susceptibility of organizations to these manual DSR attacks, it's over 25%. And they pulled these organizations from the top websites in their country. So these are large organizations; they're not mom and pop shops. The researchers also used only publicly available information, so there's no information that was gained which wasn't already usable just from finding things on social media or things that were already listed publicly. So a few other things that you can do maliciously. Guerrilla marketing. A few organizations who are privacy vendors were trying to do marketing this way. It doesn't seem very effective, but they did try. Competitor research. Actually, I don't think I have enough time to go through all of these. If you want to, you can take a photo or look online. This one is my least favorite and the most concerning: intimate partner violence, stalking, and harassment. If you live with someone, then you will get a lot of information about them and could be very abusive. You can get location data, photos, messaging history. So I think I'm going to skip this one. Organizations that don't have 2FA are especially susceptible to this as well, because if you have an automated request where you simply click a button, then someone would be able to, if they had a compromised account, or even if you just went to the library and were logged into social media, if you don't log out and there are no security procedures around requesting this information, someone can simply download all of your account history and take it. This happened to someone with Spotify because Spotify rather infamously won't add 2FA to the accounts. So this is one of the challenges. And for Twitter as well, if you submit an automated DSR through Twitter, it does ask for your password, but even if you have 2FA on the account, it doesn't trigger a 2FA again. So all you have to do is go into the settings and privacy options, and you can simply put in the password. So if the password was included in a data dump, you might not realize that your account is vulnerable because the 2FA was functional for the actual account itself. But then that secondary step is missing from this DSR portion. There's also no email or UI banner or text message letting you know that a data subject request has been made on your account. So a user who is under this type of attack wouldn't even be informed of it. When I submitted this request, the only information I got about it was this rather unhelpful email, which was already at the point where the data was ready to be downloaded, telling me to ignore it. They did finally change this, although they haven't made changes with the other suggestions that I would prefer to see included. So all you have to do is go in, click this button. You guys can do this as well. It's a really good exercise to see how this works. And then this is all the information that you get. This took about 2 hours for me to have delivered to my account. This has all of the metadata and account history. So for people who have been using Twitter for maybe 10 years, this is your entire life, potentially. Especially in the security community where Twitter features very heavily in the way that we connect with each other. Now, this used to cost £10. In the UK, you used to be able to charge for these a reasonable fee to dissuade from some of these attacks, and that's been taken away. So we've known about this as a potential problem for over 40 years. This has primarily been identified by academic researchers, so we've really struggled to bring this to light in the security community, and most people are unaware of this as a potential issue. And privacy tends to be dominated heavily by lawyers who don't tend to be very security-minded. So my plea is that you would become aware of this and make some of the changes in your organization to prevent these attacks. So, defense strategies. I'm going to have to do summary slides on some of these, so get ready with photos if you want them. There are 3 primary concerns we're trying to prevent. Abusive identity checks, where you ask for more information to verify an individual's identity than is reasonable. So asking for a passport when all you have is like an ice cream shop loyalty program, that's not reasonable. Also, the overall denial of access. You can't simply deny access as a security procedure, but also if you do incorrectly give that access, it's a data breach. So this is the sort of trifecta that we're trying to navigate through correctly. I'll skip this. You don't need to know that. So the ID challenges, you will potentially struggle to link the data correctly with one individual person. Also, you can't require that an account exists. You can't collect excessive information. The ID can't be burdensome, and even government-provided identity services are not potentially very, very good means of identifying someone. Gov.uk's own estimation of their verification accuracy is 51%. That's not very good. So also, collecting ID documents is just additional information that you now hold on that person that you could be giving out to the wrong individual. So you're just making the problem worse at that point. So remember, you don't need ID documents. This is a bad idea. Please stop doing it. It's still super common, even though we have known about this as an issue for a very long time. It's also very easy to Photoshop ID documents. This isn't challenging. Okay, so back to Blizzard. Blizzard did require government-issued photo IDs in order to delete Blizzard accounts after the protest related to the Hong Kong incident was in full force. So Twitter users were incredibly incensed about this, and rightly so, because there's no requirement to show government-issued ID in order to create the account. So they're almost holding these accounts hostage, holding the information hostage by requesting this information, which isn't even a very good way of identifying users. So there's only really 2 good methods of ID. You can use identification with one scenario where you already had that information in the first place. If you didn't have the information, don't ask for it because it's not helping you identify that person. The other good option is using shared transactional history. So confirm information that only the actual account owner would have. secret history between the organization and that user. So for example, if I go to a hotel and then I'm asked to confirm my identity by, say, the user ID. So the challenge here is like if you asked for information that could be gathered just from one source, like a credit card receipt at the hotel bar, then you're not actually confirming valid history. So you need to include multiple sources of information that wouldn't just be instantly gathered when somebody was interacting with others socially. Anybody know what this is? Arecibo. Oh, I love it when I get that answer. So the purpose of the Arecibo message was to establish shared transactional history between ourselves and potentially anyone who was listening. So this is the same idea. If we get this back to us with some changes or even just reflected back, we don't know who's on the other end and we don't need to. That's the important thing, is that we know we've established a connection, even if we are sort of agnostic to understanding the identity on the other side. So when you're thinking of data subject requests, stop getting hung up on whether you are talking to someone whose driver's license you've seen. That's not good ID. Okay, so use graduated ID requirements. Highly sensitive data requires more vetting. Low sensitivity data does not. Assume that ID numbers are compromised. This is very easy. You give your passport away to international hotels all the time. Provide secure ways for individuals to actually provide that information back to you. And consider looking at things like KYC or the NIST digital identity guidelines, because they do offer pretty good information about how to verify individuals. Okay, the automated D SARS. Re-authenticate the session, provide information to the users to let them know that this is happening, like a UI banner, email notification, and make sure that you're campaigning for 2FA so that users are more protected against account takeover. Okay, this is a photo one. I'm not going to talk about these. These are the red flags that will let you know that you're potentially in an attack. And you want to remember that bad data subject requests are a data breach. So you have to treat it as such. It is reportable. And here's my cat, because I know this is really long. Okay, I'm gonna skim through the rest of this. And if you want to see it in more depth, grab the slides online. So remember, you are allowed to reject data subject requests if you are convinced that they are invalid. You simply have to document why and explain it to the user. So these are all the reasons. Just get them online. The most important thing is that you can have privacy, you can have security without privacy, but you can't have privacy without security. So we need security individuals to understand that these attacks exist and to start getting involved with the legal teams and the people who are processing these requests. References are available here if you'd like to look up any of the information, and you can contact me on LinkedIn or Twitter. Thank you so much.